next speaker was supposed to be Chris Collins, the superintendent of the National Park Service here in St. Genevieve. Unfortunately, yesterday he came down with a medical serious sinus infection. He had to cancel some events yesterday and won't be with us today. I'll just make a few comments. You all know we've been working on this park for probably 20 years plus.
Bob, I don't think your microphone is on. There you go.
Just choke up a little bit on it.
Can you hear me now?
Just lift it up. There you go.
It won't stay up there. Well, earlier this year in February, the NPS had a session on significant statements. It was a workshop. I know Skip assisted in that. Then in April, they had another workshop on themes, and Skip asked me to submit or sit in on that. And afterwards, we saw some draft language for significant statements and themes that caused a little consternation, not more than a little. I guess it was a lot. I also know that Jim Baker and John Carroll were able to comment on those draft significant statements and themes. And you all know that there's been several newspaper articles, a big ad by Carl lamenting the fact, and it was the big concern that they had minimized the French in this work. And we had always worked for 20-some years to get the French recognized, the French culture, the French impact, not only during the French occupation, but even well beyond into the 19th century. So that is not, they have still been working on it according to Chris. He sent me a note about 2 or 3 weeks ago, said it'd be several weeks before another draft would come out to the partners, the local partners, and for another review. So that's where we are on that. I also know that they've been working on something called the House Structural Report for the Amaro. I've been lucky enough to be able to participate in that, as Jim Baker has also. It's a pretty technical analysis of the Amaro house, what's condition and what to do with it. A lot of history in there. And they've been very receptive to changes. In fact, I think if you go down now to the Amaro house, you'll see that it is called the Beauvais Amaro House. And when the NPS first put up their sign, it was the Amaro House. And they were spelling Beauvais with the B-E-A-U-V-A-I-S, and Jean-Baptiste Beauvais did not spell his name that way. It was B-A-U-V-A-I-S, as did his brother Vital. And so they've changed that so it's spelled correctly. There were things like the word Genevieve, even when they referred to the city, had an accent grave on one of the E's. And in looking, and thanks to Laurie and Margaret's work going back through the Kaskaskia manuscripts, there were very few instances where the word Genevieve had the accent grave on it. I mean, it's just not something that they did. So they've seemed to have changed that too. So I think it's important that we continue pushing for the recognition of the French. It's not to push aside the African or the native or the indigenous Americans that were here. The French had a significant influence over that period of time, and it was recognized in the special resource study. It was recognized in the enabling legislation, and that's what we've been pushing for. So we'll continue to do that. Any questions? I don't have a lot of answers yet, but it's near and dear to all of our hearts, and to tell the story of all people that were here, because as our speakers have said before, this was a confluence of cultures. We know that, but we also know that the French were very, very important in all of it, and their influence. So we'll continue to fight for it. So I'll let Sandra come up to the, oh, I forgot to mention, Chris did say, I guess I forgot to mention too, they're working on ways to get people from the Amaro house to the downtown area, paths and that sort of thing. That's another committee going on. But if you go, I'd asked Chris to give an update on all the things that are going on, but you should be able to go to their website, the St. Genevieve NPS site. They've got a team, management of the park in progress, HTML that you can probably get some more information on. Okay, Sandra?
Well, thank you. And before I introduce our next speaker, I want to be sure to recognize that we have a birthday girl in the house. I don't see her right now. Is she hiding back there? Janet, can you come out? We'd like to say happy birthday to you. Today is Janet Leonard's birthday. Oh, and of course, we cannot overlook that Will Thompson's birthday was 2 days ago. So, yes, you're welcome. Glad to share that. Won't talk about the zeros. Happy birthday. You can thank Sarah. Okay, so our next speaker, I'm pleased to introduce, is Dr. David Mcdonald, or Mac as he prefers to be called. Dr. Mcdonald completed his PhD in history at the University of Minnesota in 1972, specializing in ancient history, including Greek and Roman history. He then taught at Illinois State University from 1971 until he retired in 2005. While there, Dr. Mcdonald published 3 books and over 50 academic articles on ancient history. His latest book, titled "We Could Perceive No Sign of Them: Failed Colonies in North America, 1526 to 1689, was published in 2020. In retirement, Dr. Mcdonald has developed an interest in early Illinois and Missouri history. Based on this interest, he published Lives of Fort de Chartres, Commandants, Soldiers, and Civilians in French Illinois in 2016. His second Illinois country-related book, Kaskaskia, The Lost Capital of Illinois, was published in 2019. He has been a speaker at this conference at least twice before. At our 2014 conference, Dr. Mcdonald presented 1752, a crucial year for St. Genevieve, Fort de Chartres, and Fort Ducoigne. He presented canons for St. Genevieve at our 2018 conference. Today, Dr. Mcdonald will be presenting Jean-Baptiste Decoyne, an underappreciated leader of the Kaskaskia tribe. Please help me welcome Dr. Mcdonald.
The local goldenrod is in full bloom, and you can hear it in my voice. If I begin to fade out too much, a signal to increase would be useful, and if I bellow too much. Jean-Baptiste Decoyne was the highest chief of the Kaskaskia Indians, often spokesman for all of the Illinois tribes, and sometimes for tribes beyond Illinois, from 1774 until his death in 1811. During that time, he negotiated with the British, the Spanish, and the Americans. He aided George Rogers Clark. He fought alongside Lafayette during the American Revolution. He visited Thomas Jefferson when Jefferson was the governor of Virginia. He dined with George Washington, and he interacted with the governors of the Illinois Territory. Above all, he served to protect his people, the Kaskaskia, and the other Illinois tribes. Now, Jean-Baptiste was not born in 1750, despite frequent assertions that he was. In that year, Father Gagnon, the parish priest at St. Anne's by Fort de Chartres, baptized a child named Louis Decoyne, not Jean-Baptiste. Louis Decoyne appears in no other document, and no baptismal record survives for Jean-Baptiste. So people have jumped to the conclusion that the two must have been the same person, that Louis' name was somehow changed to Jean-Baptiste. To explain how this could happen, R.M. Owens, in an article published in 2002, suggests that, and this is a quotation, baptized as Louis, the future chief apparently changed his name, probably at his pubertal vision quest, as was common amongst the Illinois tribes. This is a weak argument. He cites only 2 sources for vision quests, the so-called Decoyne memoir and the Rondeau memoir. The Decoyne memoir is so called because the name appears at the end of the document. He was probably the copyist. Internal evidence shows the document was actually written by Pierre Charles Delier about his sojourn as a young man amongst the Illinois and other tribes about 1688. The Rondeau memoir is merely a plagiarism of Delier's work, and it is not an independent source at all, so we can dismiss it. So we're down to a single source, and what does it say? Well, it does not mention any specific tribe, and it does not mention name changes at all. Moreover, he wrote generations before Ducoigne's Adolescence, at a time that the Kaskaskia were following their native religion. By the mid-18th century, however, the Kaskaskia had long been Christianized. His mother family converted to Catholic Christianity in the late 17th century, and his father was a French-Canadian Catholic. Not a single source indicates that any of the long Christianized Kaskaskia went on vision quests in the mid-18th century or changed their names. Got my tongue twisted. And in any event, the Illinois Indians had at least two names. An Indian name, which was used familiarly amongst themselves, and a Christian baptismal name. In the unlikely event that Jean-Baptiste did go on such a quest and decided to change his name, he would have changed his Indian name and not his Catholic baptismal name. We have no baptismal record for Jean-Baptiste Decoyne for a much simpler reason. Jean-Baptiste's parents spent much of their time in Vincennes, where Jean-Baptiste was most likely born, and there are no baptismal records from Vincennes surviving from the mid-18th century. It's highly likely that Louis Decoyne was Jean-Baptiste's younger brother and died young, as so many children did during the 18th century. Jean-Baptiste's mother was Elizabeth Michel Rouensa, a familiar name. The Rouensas were the leading family amongst the Kaskaskia, even before first European contact. The most famous member of the family was Marie Rouensa Wakatawa, born about 1677. In about 1694, the Jesuit father Jacques Gravier converted her to Christianity, and I'm sure everyone here knows the story of how her father, known simply as Rouensa, was a chief of the Kaskaskia, and he wanted her to marry a French trader. But when she resisted, her father brought great pressure to bear on her. Now, without going into details, the resolution of the situation led to the conversion of her family and many members of the Kaskaskia and the other Illinois tribes. She married twice, both Frenchmen, and her daughters married important officers of Fort Richard. Her descendants and other members of the family remained important in both Indian and French communities. Jean-Baptiste's connection to the Rouensa family ensured his consideration for a leadership role amongst the Kaskaskia, but that alone would not have sufficed to make him a leader of his people. The notion that a tribe had a single chief was a white man's construct, arising out of the desire to have one person with whom to negotiate and one person to hold responsibility for the actions of a tribe. The governance of the Kaskaskia was much more complex, and whites seldom knew or wanted to be bothered with the intricacies of Indian society. The Kaskaskia, like most other Indian tribes and many other tribes, had several chiefs simultaneously. Each performed a different specific function. One might be a war chief, another a chief in time of peace. One was an orator and master of ceremonies, another a negotiator with outsiders. There was a prophet and elder advisor, and so on, and each a chief in his own right, and all chiefs were equal. But among the Kaskaskia and the other Illinois tribes, one man would usually be recognized as the paramount chief, the first amongst equals. Among the Illinois, chiefs tended to be hereditary, but not strictly or inevitably so. Warriors selected chiefs by acclamation, and heredity assured a man only consideration. Warriors would reject a man who failed to distinguish himself as a warrior, a hunter, and an orator, despite even the strongest hereditary claims. Jean-Baptiste's father, also named Jean-Baptiste Ducoigne, was born to a Montreal mercantile family. His family sent him to the Illinois country about 1736. As many other young men of similar background, he went first as an engagé, an employee under contract to a more experienced trader. Now here we have names in French and English documents of Decoyne. As you can see, there was a certain freedom in spelling. I love the one with a G. I'm sure there are more than this. The Kaskaskia manuscripts indicate that between 1742 and 1747, Jean-Baptiste, the father, was operating independently at Vincennes and Kaskaskia. At some point, he entered into a relationship with Elizabeth Michel Rouensa, and Jean-Baptiste, the son, was probably born at Vincennes during that period. It's not certain that their relationship was a church-sanctioned marriage. Father Ganon, who baptized Louis Ducoigne, had no proof they were married, and rather than the usual notice that the father was duly married to the mother, Ganon wrote on the baptismal register, "Le père est un nom Ducoigne." The father is one named Ducoigne. Jean-Baptiste Ducoigne, the father, went on to have a long and complex life. He did not remain long in Illinois after the baptism of Louis Ducoigne. During the winter of 1750-51, he was with the English at Fort Edward in New York. And at that time, he was still also in communication with Canada. Both the English and the French authorities were suspicious of his loyalty and both ordered his arrest, but nothing ever came of it. A few years later, 1758, the British commander, James Abercrombie, personally questioned Decoyne, who must have given a very good account of himself since the British subsequently employed him as an interpreter and a secret agent operating amongst the Indians. At one point, he was captured by the Cherokee, but talked his way out of that difficulty and was adopted into the tribe. As a British agent, he lived and circulated amongst the Ojibwa, the Potawatomi, various other tribes on the Ohio River, and also amongst the Iroquois, and even had a son by a Seneca woman. In 1778, he was employed as the interpreter at Niagara, but his eyesight was failing, and he soon retired to Montreal, where he was still living in 1796. Nothing's known of Jean-Baptiste the son's adolescence or childhood. He was literate, both fluent in both French and Illinois languages, and he seems to have learned English later in life. He was also an able orator in the Indian tradition. During the French and Indian War, the Illinois naturally supported the French, and they remained antagonistic to the British after the war. One would expect that the Illinois and the famous Pontiac, who was so instrumental in the great Indian uprising against the British at the end of the war, would have been natural allies. Pontiac is now much celebrated as a hero of Native American resistance to European and particularly British expansion, but in fact, he often behaved himself much like a drunken thug. In 1766, Jean-Baptiste was at Detroit with two other Illinois, one a chief. The chief got into an argument about intertribal relations with Pontiac, who made his point by stabbing the Illinois chief. We do not know whether the stabbed chief lived or died, but during the same year or early in 1767, a chief of the Kaskaskia did die, and during that same year, or early 1767, Jean-Baptiste succeeded to that chief's position, not as the paramount chief. The British Indian agent Edward Cole, writing to the British Superintendent of Indian Affairs, George Croghan, describes Jean-Baptiste's elevation, and again I quote here, "The nation," which he means the Kaskaskia, "assembled before me in order to have another chief. Young Ducoigne being the next heir, he was unanimously pitched on if agreeable to me. I would have no objections, knowing him to be a fine young fellow, not debauched with liquors, and from the readiness he shows to receive advice and good behavior, make me think he will become one of the greatest chiefs in this country." Now let's see if I can remember how to work this. Here's a Kaskaskian warrior painted as a vignette on a French map of 1796. The warrior's appearance is probably not much different than it would have been in 1767. Jean-Baptiste was a realist, and as it became apparent that the British were the new power in Illinois, he helped forge reconciliation between the Illinois and the British. In 1771, Father Gibault, curé at Kaskaskia, baptized Francois, the daughter of Jean-Baptiste, and his wife Marie Joseph. The next year, 1772, Gibault baptized a second daughter, Therese Helene, daughter of Jean-Baptiste and his wife Helene. Marie Joseph must have died soon after the birth of her daughter, and of course, rapid marriage was very common. In late 1773 or 1774, the old paramount chief of the Kaskaskia, Tomera, also called Tamaroy, died, and the Kaskaskia chose Jean-Baptiste to succeed him. Such a rapid promotion was unusual and must reflect that he was held in high regard by the tribe. Excuse me. Decoyne's good relations with the British must have also played a role. Decoyne led the Kaskaskia during the next 4 decades and faced great challenges, chief among which were the murderous attacks by other tribes. During the French and Indian War, the Cherokee and Chickasaw, who were allied with the British, attacked the Illinois. But with the end of the war, the British were able to arrange a peace between the tribes. Tensions, however, remained high, and in 1772, violence broke out in the French village of Kaskaskia when both the Kaskaskia and Chickasaw came to trade at the same time. British troops intervened to restore order on this occasion, but in general they did little or nothing. And Illinois was becoming increasingly unsafe for the Illinois tribes. Once numbering 9,000 or 10,000 at the time of first European contact, the population of the Illinois tribes had declined precipitously as the result of European diseases, alcoholism, and warfare. As their members dwindled, other tribes, themselves displaced directly or indirectly by white encroachment, moved increasingly into territory formerly dominated by the Illinois. The Illinois were so reduced in number that they were seldom able to resist such intrusions effectively. It's impossible to get an accurate estimate of the number of Illinois Indians surviving in the 1770s and 1780s. Some whites purposely underreported their numbers as sort of a justification for their intrusion into Illinois territory. And in other cases, so-called estimates were no more than guesses based on incomplete knowledge. Still, it's apparent that by the time Jean-Baptiste Decoyne became the paramount chief in 1774, the Illinois were numbered in the hundreds rather than the thousands. The Fox Indians in Illinois were already hereditary enemies when the first French appeared in Illinois in the late 17th century. In 1730, the Illinois were part of an alliance of tribes that, along with the French, almost wiped out the Fox. But by mid-century, the Fox had revived. They, along with the Sauk and other allies, raided the Illinois Cahokia and Michigamia in 1752, killing about 80, and more raids followed over the next decades. By 1774, hostile tribes had made the homelands of the Illinois so unsafe that Decoyne was determined to lead his people down the Mississippi River from Illinois. Not even the highest chief, however, could order people. All a chief could ever do is attempt to persuade, and Ducoigne could not persuade all to follow him. But he did lead about 80 families down the Mississippi while others remained behind. In 1775, the Sauk and Fox attacked those who remained in Illinois. They first went to the village a few miles north of French Kaskaskia, but they found it vacant and burned it to the ground. The Fox and Sauk next entered French Kaskaskia, seeking the Kaskaskia Indians, but found them not there, and left without doing any violence to the French. The Kaskaskia Indians were in fact in their summer hunting ground across the Mississippi on the River Avas. The Fox and Sauk found the Kaskaskia there and attacked without warning, killing 44 Kaskaskia men, women, and children, and taking several prisoners. The Kaskaskia fought back and managed to kill 2 of the enemy's chiefs and killed and wounded a number of their warriors. Although larger in scale, this sort of raid was typical of violence visited upon the Kaskaskia as their numbers declined and their hold on territory slackened. Damn goldenrod. Meanwhile, in the south, Decoyne led his followers up the Kaskaskia River with the Spanish commandant Don Joseph de Orelleta offered them land to farm near the Copa village by Fort Carlos III. Decoyne would have preferred to establish a separate village on the White River, but the commandant refused, probably because he wanted to keep a close check on the new arrivals. Decoyne decided to appeal to the governor, Don Luis de Unzaga y Amerezaga. So he, along with a group of followers that perhaps included a Copa who could speak Spanish, traveled to the most northerly Spanish post on the east bank of the Mississippi River. That was Fort San Gabriel de Manchac. There his representative gave a petition to the Spanish commandant, Don Jose de Acosta, to forward to the governor. A curious problem came out of this meeting. A Spanish account describes Jean-Baptiste as mozo de 20 años, a young man of 20 years. That would have suggested that Jean-Baptiste was born about 1755, but Jean-Baptiste became a chief of the Kaskaskia in 1767, and it's inconceivable that even a member of the Rouenza family would become a chief at the age of 12. At a minimum, a chief would expect to be in his 20s, and that agrees with his father's activities in the in the Illinois country. Decoyne did not speak Spanish. The Spanish officer did not speak Illinois. Most likely the Spanish officer mistook Decoyne's spokesman for the chief himself, who simply underestimated Jean-Baptiste's age. Assuming Jean-Baptiste was born about 1745, he would have been about 30 years old at the time. We have only one description of him made later in life when he was depicted as being, this is a quotation, of small size and usually active. He could with greatest ease climb a smooth tree 50 or 60 feet high without a limb. Rather than settling on the White River, Decoyne was aware of the quickly evolving situation, decided to return to, excuse me, I missed something here. My apologies. During the time in Arkansas, Jean-Baptiste and Helene had another son, also named Jean-Baptiste Decoyne. This is why genealogy gets complex. 2 years later, Father Jabal baptized the infant. The outbreak of the American Revolution brought changes for Decoyne and Kaskaskia. Spain supported the rebels against Britain, at first secretly, and the Kaskaskia in Arkansas played a role attacking British traders on the Mississippi. The new Spanish governor, Don Bernardo Vincennes de Galvez y Madrid, whom you see here, had more faith in Decoyne and gave him permission to settle on the White River. Governor Bernardo de Galvez went on to become one of the true and largely unsung heroes of the American Revolution. He captured Pensacola from the British at great personal risk and eliminated the British threat to the southern colonies from the British in Florida. Now, rather settling on the White River, Decoyne, who was aware of the quickly evolving situation, decided to return to Illinois. He and his followers departed from Arkansas in late 1777, but the situation in Illinois was still at flux. The British troops had departed, but a governor appointed by the British was still in place. Decoyne's band made camp on the western Spanish side of the river, about 40 miles south of Sainte-Geneviève, where some of those who had remained in Illinois joined him. Others returned to their burnt village. Then, in the summer of 1778, George Rogers Clark and a small force seized Kaskaskia and all of French Illinois. A portrait of George Rogers Clark in old age, painted about 1810 by C.D. Cook. The only portraits of Clark as a young man are late and imaginary. The Illinois French, with no love for the British and no other choice, cooperated with Clark, and Decoyne saw in Clark and the Americans the possible opportunity to improve the lot of the Kaskaskia. Decoyne, speaking for both the Kaskaskia and the Peoria, immediately sought peace and alliance with Clark, and he did much more. He provided Clark with hunters who brought fresh meat for his men, with scouts who reported on the British, while Decoyne himself negotiated with the Miami and Chickasaw on Clark's behalf. Henry Hamilton, the British governor in Detroit, had reason to fear Jean-Baptiste's activities and angrily refers to him in a report as, and again I quote, "the bastard savage son of the old man, now interpreter at Niagara." And there is Henry Hamilton, white glass relief by the Scottish artist James Tassie, 1786. Jean-Baptiste did still more for the American cause. Before the end of 1778, he went with 100 warriors to Virginia, where he fought under the command of the Marquis de Lafayette, who came to America bringing with him a shipment of arms and ammunition that he purchased from his own funds and which he presented to Washington. He fought with distinction throughout the Revolution, returning to France only after victory, where he continued the campaign for democracy. And at the end of the campaign, Lafayette presented Decoyne with a written testimonial and thanks for his service. George Rogers Clark withdrew most of his forces from Illinois in 1780 and the rest in 1781. The United States now held vast western territories, including Illinois, but the young nation lacked the resources and organization to govern the area. The French and Illinois Indians were both left in a state of virtual anarchy. The Kaskaskia and Illinois tribes were particularly victimized. Fox, Sauk, Kickapoo, Shawnee, Potawatomi, Cherokee, and Chickasaw all raided into Illinois, and many began to move into territory long held by the Illinois Indians. The Illinois did what they could to resist, but their numbers were too few. In 1781, Jean-Baptiste journeyed to meet Thomas Jefferson, then governor of Virginia. And here is a portrait of Jefferson that I'm sure you will all recognize. I apologize. Clark had acted in the name of Virginia, and Virginia then claimed the Illinois territory, and Jefferson was governor of Virginia. The meeting with Jefferson was very cordial, but the two men had different agendas. Jefferson was concerned about the British, who still controlled a strong base at Detroit and could threaten the Illinois Territory. Ducoigne sought American protection against hostile tribes intruding into Illinois. Duquesne could do nothing for Jefferson's concerns, and Jefferson lacked forces to aid Ducoigne. Nevertheless, Jefferson impressed Ducoigne, and he named his second son Louis Jefferson Ducoigne, born probably soon after the meeting with Jefferson. In 1787, the Congress of the United States passed the Northwest Ordinance. The states surrendered their western land claims, including Illinois country, to the federal government, which formed them into the Northwest Territory. The Revolutionary General Arthur St. Clair became the first governor of the Northwest Territory. He established his headquarters at Fort Washington, which is today Cincinnati. And here's the man, his portrait, a watercolor on ivory by Jean-Pierre-Henri Elouis, about 1795. In 1790, Arthur St. Clair met Jean-Baptiste Decoyne and delivered a speech filled with praise for his long friendship with the United States and expressing sympathy for the Kaskaskia, so badly abused by other tribes. St. Clair also promised support, but his promises lacked specificity and were ultimately insubstantial. A few days before this laudatory speech, St. Clair wrote to the Secretary of War in Washington in a much different tone regarding Ducoigne and Indians in general. Baptiste, this is a quotation, Baptiste Ducoigne, who you may remember with the Marquis de Lafayette, is the chief of the Kaskaskia nation and settled in Kaskaskia. I have been plagued with a great many of his talks. The nation is very inconsiderable, and I do not think it necessary to trouble you with them at present. He himself is the greatest beggar I have met amongst the nations, who are all beggars. He accounts no little for having been with the American troops in Virginia, and so far merits some countenance. St. Clair's dismissive attitude towards Indians soon bore bitter fruit. The tribes living along the upper Wabash, particularly the Miami, faced settlers and land companies intruding into their territory, both supported by elements of the American government. The Miami, along with other tribes in the region, struck back at the intruders, and that provoked a response from the American government. In 1790, General Joseph Harmore put together a mixed force consisting initially of 353 regular soldiers and about 1,300 militia to move against the Miami. Harmore knew nothing about frontier warfare, quarreled with his subordinates, and the great majority of his army were untrained and ill-disciplined. Under the leadership of Little Turtle, the Miami and their allies defeated Harmore's forces in several engagements, killing about 200. St. Clair replaced Harmore, and in 1791, he led a force of about 2,000 men, regulars, 6-month conscripts, and militia against the Indians on the upper Wabash. All the faults of the previous expedition were repeated in St. Clair's campaign. The troops were inadequately equipped and poorly disciplined. St. Clair allowed over 200 camp followers to accompany the expedition. The camp followers consisted of sutlers who sold a variety of goods, women who washed clothes, and ladies of negotiable virtue. The soldiers had no enthusiasm for the campaign, and by the time they'd reached the upper Wabash, desertion and illness had reduced the force from 2,000 to 920. Like Harmore, St. Clair despised Indians and underestimated them. Little Turtle, leader of the Miami, again proved a better commander. Under his direction, a confederation of tribes attacked and routed the American force, killing 632 officers and men and almost all of the camp followers. American wounded numbered 264. Of the force, only 24 escaped unscathed, one of whom was General St. Clair, who fled on a pack mule. Not the most glorious He spent the rest of his life writing justifications of why he was not to blame for that. Sinclair was replaced by Anthony Wayne, a more careful and able general who in 1794 defeated the Indian coalition at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. And here is Anthony Wayne, pastel on paper by James Sharple, Sr., 1796. After the defeat of the generals Harmar and Sinclair, Secretary of War Henry Knox called for a peace conference, but the tribes on the Upper Wabash refused to attend. Decoyne, however, was eager to meet with the president, George Washington. He traveled to Philadelphia at the head of a delegation of 15 or 16 men and 3 women, representing the Kaskaskia, the Peoria, a southern group of the Potawatomi, Piankashaw, Muscooten, and others. They arrived in 1792 and remained there until May 1793. During that time, Decoyne dined with Washington and other high officials of the administration on 2 occasions, including Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of War Henry Knox, Attorney General Edmund Randolph, and others. Decoyne informed Washington and others about the aggression of the whites who were moving into tribal lands in increasing number. Decoyne's speech is preserved in the papers of George Washington, the presidential series. I quote only from the beginning of his oration. "Father, your people of Illinois are like mosquitoes and try to destroy the red men, but I look to you as to a good being. Order your people to be just. They are always trying to get our lands. They come on our lands. They hunt on them. They kill our game and they kill us. Keep them on one side of the line and us on the other." Washington presented Decoyne with a medal, and that medal, along with the presentation certificate, is preserved in the Chicago Historical Society. And this is the very medal that was given to Decoyne. Despite all the pomp and the pretty medal, nothing significantly changed. Other tribes continued to intrude far into Illinois and to attack the Illinois. White settlers sometimes clashed with hostile Indians and then failed to distinguish them from peaceful, friendly Indians like the Illinois, who were liable to be killed in retaliation for actions of entirely different tribes. Alcoholism and diseases continued to take a toll. Under all these pressures, tribal unity began to collapse. When tribes could not protect their members, individuals, families, and small groups of families broke away. Some managed to join other stronger tribes, while others clustered in refugee communities, sometimes in the fringes of white villages. There was one such village on the outskirts of Genevieve. Even tribal names began to disappear. By 1800, the Kaskaskia had replaced the names of the Cahokia, Tamarora, and even the Michigamia, who had completely disappeared except in the formal language of treaties. Kaskaskia itself was eventually replaced by Peoria as the collective designation of all the surviving Illinois. In 1800, Congress created the Territory of Indiana, which included Illinois, and William Henry Harrison became the territorial governor. And here he is, etching on paper with hand-colored aquatint, now faded, by William Strickland, 1813. Harrison was charged with taking control of Indian affairs and opening the territory for American settlers. In 1803, Harrison, Ducoigne, and 5 other Illinois signed the Treaty of Incense. I quote from the first 2 articles. Whereas, from a variety of unfortunate circumstances, the several tribes of Illinois Indians are reduced to a very small number, the remains of which had long been consolidated and known by the name of the Kaskaskia tribe, and finding themselves unable to occupy the extensive tract of land which of right belongs to them and which was possessed by their ancestors for many generations, the chief and warriors of said tribes, being also desirous of procuring the means of improvement of the arts of civilized life, and a more effective and certain support of their women and children have, for the considerations herein mentioned, relinquished, and by these presents do relinquish and cede to the United States all the lands in the Illinois country, which said tribe has heretofore possessed, or which they might rightfully claim, reserving to themselves, however, the tract of about 350 acres near the town of Kaskaskia, which they have always held and which was secured to them by the Act of Congress on the 3rd of March, 1791. And also the right of locating another tract of 1,280 acres within the bounds of that now ceded, which 2 tracts shall remain for them forever. Second article, the United States will take the Kaskaskia tribe under their immediate care and patronage and will afford them a protection as effectual against other Indian tribes and against all other persons whatever as is enjoyed by their own citizens. In addition to the tracts of land, the Kaskaskia were to receive annually a subsidy of $1,000 in money or goods. And the United States also undertook to build a house at Kaskaskia and fence a plot of 100 acres for Decoyne as chief, and to pay for the construction of a church and support of a priest for the tribe. It might seem as if the tribe received little in exchange for over 8 million acres of land, but in reality, the Illinois merely relinquished the empty title to lands already lost. The tribe selected land south of Kaskaskia in the Sand Ridge Township near the Big Muddy River. Most of the remaining Kaskaskia moved there, and the village north of the town of Kaskaskia was reduced to just a few families. The government built a good stone house for Decoyne near Kaskaskia, where he seems to have raised crops and bred horses. This is Decoyne's house photographed in 1893. Government protection proved less effective than promised. During the winter of 1804, the Potawatomi raided the Kaskaskia. In 1809, the Kickapoo killed Decoyne's brother-in-law and stole 30 horses. Jean-Baptiste lived in the house built by the government till his death in 1811. And until the end, he continued to work for the Kaskaskia, protesting tribal and white violence and attempts to usurp even their small remaining territory. During his long career, Ducoigne had never been able to act from a position of strength. Even before he first became paramount chief in 1774, the Kaskaskia and other tribes were already sadly reduced in number, and considering their weakness, it's striking that Decoyne achieved as much as he did, maneuvering amongst the British, the Spanish, and the Americans to protect his people and stave off threats as best he could from other marauding tribes and white settlers. The end, however, was inevitable. Decoyne's son, Louis Jefferson Decoyne, succeeded him as chief, but a contemporary describes him and his brother Jean-Baptiste Decoyne as worthless alcoholics. In 1820, most of the remaining Kaskaskia crossed over to Missouri, where they joined the Peoria. A few remained near Kaskaskia and on the Sand Ridge Tract. In the mid-1830s, even these remnants left Illinois, and officially, the history of the Kaskaskia and the other Illinois tribes in the state came to an end. Other reports, however, indicate that some individuals and even families managed to remain and remain even today conscious of their heritage. Sorry for all the talking.
So we take any questions, if anybody has a question?
Just be conscious that I'm deaf as a post. You may have to repeat yourself a couple times before I can hear you. Yeah.
Where the Sand Ridge plot was, is that near the modern town of Ducoigne, Illinois?
I don't think the modern town of Ducoigne has really any connection with them at all, and I have no idea why it got named that. And their little sketch of Ducoigne on their website is filled with half-truths and inaccuracies.
sand beach that he mentioned would have been on the, what we now think of as the island of Kaskaskia, right?
Down by the Muddy River,
Okay,
south of Kaskaskia.
okay.
I'd like to get down there and see if I could use the coordinates that they give to actually figure out what piece of land.
Is the actual Kaskaskia village, is that up like near the Kaskaskia Dam?
A bit to the north of that.